On a storm-torn night in Monaco, a 5-year-old boy clutched an empty pillbox and whispered to a billionaire, "Sir, could I sleep in your doghouse just for one night?" No one knew that behind those trembling words lay a mother imprisoned for stealing medicine to save her child. From that moment on, two broken fates would entwine, and neither would ever be the same. The storm had been building all afternoon. By nightfall, Monaco was no longer the radiant jewel of the Riviera, but a city drowned in water and glass. The yachts at Port Hercules strained against their moorings, their masts swaying like dying trees. Thunder rolled across the cliffs, echoing through narrow lanes where neon blurred and vanished beneath the sheets of rain. And in the middle of this tempest, barefoot and soaked, walked a boy no taller than a lamppost. His name was Ben. He was 5 years old, though the lines of hunger and worry carved into his tiny face gave him the solemnity of someone far older. His shirt clung to his ribs, his trousers were torn at the knees, and his only possession, a small white pillbox, rattled emptily in his pocket. He held it like a talisman, though inside there was nothing left, nothing but memory. The pills had been his mother's desperate attempt to keep him alive. When the fever first struck, she had begged the pharmacists for mercy. They refused. Rules were rules. Clara, a young mother with no husband, had done the unthinkable. She slipped the medicine into her bag and walked out. The cameras caught her before she reached the corner. Now she sat behind the bars of a prison cell, branded as a thief. Not a word was spoken in court about the boy waiting for her, coughing through the night, burning with fever. And so Ben walked alone through the storm. He did not know where to go, only that he had to keep moving. The alleys of Monaco were merciless. Cold stone, glittering cars that never stopped, people who looked away the moment they saw him. He had slept under benches, in stairwells, once even inside a dumpster until rats forced him out. But tonight the storm was too fierce. His little body shook uncontrollably. Each lightning strike made him flinch. Through the blur of rain he saw it, a white mansion rising on the hillside above the sea, its windows glowing faintly against the storm. High iron gates guarded the path. To Ben it looked like a palace from a fairy tale, though he knew fairy tales were for other children, not for him. Still, something pulled him forward. He staggered to the gate, pressed his hands to the cold bars, and whispered through lips turned blue, "Please." Inside the mansion, Jonathan Hale stood before a tall window, a glass of untouched brandy in his hand. He was a man both envied and feared, one of Europe's most powerful real estate magnates. He had raised towers of steel in London, carved entire districts from the soil of Dubai, turned ruins into monuments. And yet his house, filled with priceless art, remained silent as a tomb. Jonathan lived alone. He had built an empire but destroyed every relationship in its shadow. His father had abandoned him for ambition, and he, in turn, had done the same to his own brief marriage. What remained was money, cold and immaculate, stacked higher than any cathedral. The storm did not disturb him. He was used to storms, but the sound that reached his ear now was different, fragile, insistent. A knock at the gate. Jonathan frowned. He rarely received visitors, never unannounced. With irritation, he pulled on a coat and stepped into the rain. The iron gates loomed, and there, illuminated by lightning, stood the boy. For a moment, Jonathan thought he was a mirage. Too small, too drenched, too lost. But then the boy lifted his face, and Jonathan saw eyes the color of midnight, eyes that carried both terror and a plea that no man could mistake. "Sir," the voice trembled, Could I sleep in your doghouse? Just for one night?" Jonathan froze. He had faced bankers who demanded billions, politicians who threatened collapse, rivals who plotted in shadows. None had disarmed him the way this child did, with 7 words spoken through chattering teeth. A part of him wanted to turn away. This was Monaco, after all. Stray children meant trouble. Newspapers loved a scandal, and his enemies loved blood. He could already imagine the headlines: "Billionaire hides orphan in mansion, mother a convicted thief." But the boy's shoulders shook so violently, the pillbox clutched so tightly, that Jonathan's practiced indifference cracked. Something in those eyes dragged him backward through time, back to a cemetery where a younger Jonathan had stood, 8 years old, watching the coffin of his mother sink into the ground. He remembered the silence afterward, the emptiness no fortune ever filled. He heard himself whisper, almost against his will, "Not the doghouse. Come inside." The mansion door closed against the storm, but inside, the silence was deeper. Marble floors gleamed, chandeliers hung like frozen constellations, but all of it felt colder than the rain. The boy stood dripping on the carpet, too afraid to move. Jonathan poured warm water into a basin, brought towels, and without knowing why, knelt before the child. He peeled the wet shirt from the boy's narrow shoulders, rubbed the chill from his arms, then handed him a blanket so large it swallowed him whole. The boy's lips quivered around the first bite of bread, then softened when Jonathan slid a cup of milk toward him. "Eat," Jonathan said gruffly. But the boy's eyes shone with gratitude so fierce it was almost unbearable. When at last the child's eyelids drooped, Jonathan carried him, awkwardly, as if lifting something fragile, to a guest room. The boy curled instantly on the bed, clutching the blanket like a lifeline. Jonathan stood at the doorway long after the storm quieted. He told himself it was nothing, just a night's kindness, a debt paid to a ghost of his past. And yet as the hours dragged on, sleep refused to come. He sat before the fire, staring into flames that flickered like old memories. He had given the boy food and shelter, yes. But why did it feel as though the boy had given him something greater, something he did not dare to name? When dawn touched the Riviera, Jonathan Hale was no longer the same man who had poured himself brandy the night before. For in the silence of his mansion, for the first time in decades, he was no longer alone. The dawn over Monaco broke reluctantly, as if ashamed of the night it had just delivered. Clouds still loitered above the Mediterranean, gray and heavy, though streaks of gold began to pierce their edges. From the balcony of his mansion, Jonathan Hale watched the sea writhe below. He had not slept. The child's presence lingered in his mind like the echo of a hymn he could not forget. Jonathan was a man trained to calculate risk, to see danger in contracts, betrayal in smiles, collapse in numbers. He had built skyscrapers by trusting no one. And yet, when he turned from the balcony and saw the boy curled on the couch by the fire, swaddled in blankets too big for him, he felt his defenses quake. The boy stirred. His eyelids fluttered, lashes heavy with exhaustion. Slowly he sat up, blinking as if unsure whether the warmth and safety were real or simply another dream that would dissolve in rain. He held the pillbox against his chest like a shield. Jonathan approached, his footsteps resonant on the marble. "What's your name, child?" The boy hesitated, his lips trembling before forming the word. "Ben," Jonathan nodded. "You're safe here, Ben. The storm is gone." But the boy did not smile. Instead, he lowered his gaze, as though words burned too much to carry. Jonathan was about to ask again when the boy's voice, small, quivering, desperate, rose into the silence. "Sir, if you don't want me inside, could I at least sleep in your doghouse?" Jonathan's chest tightened. Of all the pleas he had expected, food, money, pity, he had not imagined this. not the request to be given less than a dog. The boy's eyes flicked upward, searching his face not for kindness, but simply for the absence of cruelty. It was not just a question. It was a confession. This was how the world had trained him to measure his worth. Jonathan knelt. He was a tall man, his presence commanding in every boardroom he entered, yet here he lowered himself until his eyes met the boy's. The fire cast shadows across his face, softening the steel of his features. "Ben," he said, voice unsteady in a way that startled even himself. "You don't belong in a doghouse. You belong where you can be warm, where you can rest without fear." The boy blinked, stunned, as though the sentence itself was too generous to be true. Tears welled in his eyes, unbidden, falling onto the marble floor with a sound more profound than thunder. He pressed the pillbox into Jonathan's hand, whispering, "My mom. She went away because of this. She said it was to help me, but now she's gone, and I don't know if she's ever coming back." Jonathan looked down at the pillbox, so light, so empty, yet heavier than any contract he had ever signed. He imagined a mother's hand slipping it into her purse, knowing the cameras were watching, knowing the price she would pay, but choosing her child's life over law. He imagined the cold clang of prison doors, the echo of footsteps down a corridor where no one cared about motives, only crimes. And then he looked at the boy, fragile, soaked by the world, standing at the edge of a future that could so easily consume him. In that instant, Jonathan's empire, his glass towers, his iron gates, his millions stacked like monuments, felt like sand. None of it could shield him from the truth standing before him. He had the power to open doors, to crush enemies, to buy silence. But could he answer the question of a child who had asked only for a doghouse? Jonathan drew a long breath, as though sealing a vow he had not yet spoken. "Ben, as long as you are under my roof, you will not be less than any child in this city. You will eat, you will sleep, you will have warmth. I cannot promise what tomorrow brings, but tonight, you will not be alone." The boy stared at him for a long moment, then leaned forward, clutching Jonathan's sleeve with both hands. He said nothing more. He did not need to. The touch was enough. It was the first act of trust he had given the world since his mother disappeared behind prison walls. Outside, the sea began to calm. The clouds thinned, and in the silence of the mansion, for the second time in his life, Jonathan Hale felt a wordless truth. Salvation often entered not as triumph, but as a trembling plea at one's gate. The storm had passed, but inside the Hale mansion, silence remained a storm of its own. The marble floors reflected morning light, cold and indifferent, as though the house itself had grown accustomed to emptiness. For years, Jonathan Hale had lived in this mausoleum of wealth, without once noticing how lifeless it truly was. Now, there was a sound that had never belonged here before, the faint shuffle of small feet on polished stone. Ben emerged from the guest room, still wrapped in the oversized blanket. His hair, damp from the bath Jonathan had insisted upon, clung in unruly strands across his forehead. He carried the empty pillbox in one hand, as though afraid someone might steal even its nothingness. His eyes darted around the vastness of the hall, wide with both wonder and fear. Jonathan set aside the morning paper he had not read and studied the child. He had hosted ministers, moguls, even kings beneath this roof, but never had any guest unsettled him like this boy who stood uncertain at the threshold, too small for the grandeur that surrounded him. "Hungry?" Jonathan asked at last, the word sounding foreign on his tongue. Ben hesitated, then gave a tiny nod. Jonathan rose. He could have summoned a servant, pressed a button, given an order, but something within him resisted that impulse. Instead, he walked to the kitchen himself, his footsteps echoing down a corridor he had not entered in months. Cabinets stood immaculate, untouched by human hands. He fumbled, searching until he found bread, butter, and a carton of milk. When he set the food before the boy, Ben stared as if confronted with treasure. He bit into the bread so quickly crumbs tumbled across the table, and then paused, embarrassed, as though expecting rebuke. Jonathan merely slid the plate closer. "Eat slowly," he said, softer this time. Ben obeyed, but with every bite, the sharp bones of his face seemed to soften, the fear retreating ever so slightly. Jonathan poured the milk into a glass, placed it before him, and watched as the boy drank greedily, a mustache of white clinging to his upper lip. The sight drew something unexpected from Jonathan, a chuckle, low and startled, as though a forgotten part of him had awoken. Ben blinked at the sound. For the first time, the corners of his mouth lifted. It was not quite a smile, but it was enough. The mansion shifted in that moment. The silence cracked. It was not the clinking of crystal, nor the rustle of contracts, nor the sterile murmur of television screens. It was the sound of a child breathing, eating, existing, and it filled the house with a warmth more costly than any fire Jonathan had ever lit. Yet even as the warmth grew, shadows lingered. Jonathan could not forget the boy's plea from the night before. The doghouse. The words stabbed at him again, for they revealed a childhood bent beneath a weight no child should carry. He imagined what nights had carved that plea into the boy's heart. Alleys, rejection, fear. And he knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that letting the boy return to those streets was no longer an option. After breakfast, Jonathan led Ben to the great hall where a fire still smoldered in the hearth. He knelt again so that his gaze met the child's. "Ben," he said, careful with each syllable, "you will stay here tonight, and tomorrow, and until you are safe. Do you understand?" The boy gripped the pillbox tighter. "But people don't keep me. They send me away." Jonathan's chest tightened. He had been sent away once, too, by a father who chose reputation over blood. The memory still seared. He reached forward, placed his hand gently over the boy's, steadying the trembling fingers that clutched at nothing. "I am not people," Jonathan said. His voice was rough, almost a vow. "You are safe here." Ben's eyes filled with tears. He did not weep loudly. He had learned long ago that loud tears brought punishment, not comfort. Instead, he let the tears fall silently as he leaned forward, resting his small head against Jonathan's chest. Jonathan froze, every instinct of his carefully managed life shouting to keep distance. And yet, he wrapped his arms around the child. The embrace was awkward, hesitant, but real. He felt the boy's heartbeat against his suit, fragile but insistent, like the ticking of a watch reminding him that time, once lost, could never be bought back. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt something stir that neither empire nor wealth had ever given him. A sense that he was no longer standing at the pinnacle of his own solitude, but at the threshold of something far greater and infinitely more dangerous. The fire crackled. The boy's breathing slowed against him. And Jonathan, staring into the flames, understood that his life had just tilted irreversibly toward a path he could not yet see. The storm had ended, but in its wake a new storm began, one not of rain or thunder, but of choices that would demand more of him than any fortune ever had. The warmth of the mansion lasted 3 nights. 3 nights of milk and bread, of blankets and firelight, of silence broken only by the sound of a small child breathing peacefully. For Jonathan Hale, those nights were both balm and torment. Balm because for the first time in decades, his house no longer felt like a mausoleum. Torment because he knew peace, This fragile could not last. On the fourth day, business called him away. Milan, city of glass towers and cobbled alleys, where fortunes were inked in boardrooms and erased in whispers. Jonathan's empire depended on appearances. He could not vanish without questions. So he took Ben with him, under the pretense of a trip. Perhaps, he told himself, the boy would see the world, would breathe air not laced with fear. But cities have long memories, and the streets remember those who wander them. As Jonathan's black car swept through the narrow arteries of Milan, Ben pressed his face to the glass. Neon signs blurred. Vendors shouted in dialects he did not know. The boy's eyes widened at the bustle, but in their depths lingered the haunted vigilance of a child too used to scanning for danger. That danger found him quickly. They were men who lived on shadows, petty criminals, traffickers of children who vanished from alleys and reappeared as nameless labor in unseen markets. They noticed Ben the moment he stepped with Jonathan into the Piazza Mercanti. A small figure clinging to the sleeve of a man who looked powerful but distracted. They whispered among themselves, recognizing him. "The thief's boy," one muttered. "The woman in prison. No father. No family." "Alone," another grinned. "Easier than most." Their eyes glittered with opportunity. Children like Ben were currency. Desperation was profit. Jonathan felt it before he saw it, the sudden tightening of the crowd, the way strangers lingered too long in their path. His instincts, honed in hostile boardrooms, flared. He tightened his grip on Ben's hand, scanning faces. Eyes followed them, unblinking, calculating. Then, the move. A man stepped forward, accidentally, colliding with Jonathan, while another reached for Ben's arm. Jonathan reacted with a fury that startled even himself. His voice cut through the square like a blade. "Don't touch him." The crowd stilled. For a moment the men hesitated, reading not only the strength in Jonathan's posture but also the authority of someone accustomed to command. He was no wandering tourist. He was a man who owned towers. And yet the danger did not vanish. It slithered back into the shadows, watching, waiting. That night, Jonathan lay awake in the suite, Ben asleep beside him on the second bed. He stared at the ceiling, replaying the moment again and again. The child had been nearly taken from him, plucked as easily as a coin from a fountain. It was then he understood. This was not a charity act, not a passing kindness. The world was hunting children like Ben, and unless Jonathan stood between, the boy's story would end as just another forgotten tragedy whispered in alleyways. Jonathan rose, walked to the window, and looked over the Milan skyline, its cathedral spires piercing the clouds, its alleys crawling with shadows. He clenched his fist. For the first time in decades, his wealth and power no longer seemed like a shield for himself, but a weapon to wield for another. Behind him, Ben stirred, murmured in his sleep. Jonathan turned, saw the boy clutching the blanket like a lifeline, and whispered into the darkness, words he had never spoken aloud, even to himself. "You are mine now, and God help anyone who tries to take you." Outside, the city pulsed with danger. But within that room, a new kind of vow had been forged, silent, irrevocable, and stronger than any empire. Wealth has many enemies, but the fiercest opposition often rises not from the streets. It comes from the dining table of one's own family. Jonathan Hale learned this truth on a Sunday afternoon when his sister, Evelyn Hale, swept into the Monaco mansion. She was the mirror of her brother in many ways, tall, commanding, sharp as a blade. But where Jonathan's solitude had carved him into stone, Evelyn's ambition had polished her into steel. The moment her eyes fell on Ben, small, shy, clutching the edge of Jonathan's sleeve, her face hardened. "What is this?" she demanded. "A child," Jonathan said evenly. "I can see that." Why is he here? Jonathan did not answer immediately. Instead, he guided Ben to a chair, placed a hand on his shoulder, and poured him a glass of juice. The boy sipped cautiously, sensing the storm that brewed not outside but within these walls. Evelyn's voice sharpened, echoing against the marble. You've lost your mind. Do you know what the press will do when they discover this? The Hale Empire tainted by scandal. Billionaire shelters son of a criminal. Do you want to see everything we've built collapse in one headline? Jonathan's gaze flickered, steel against steel. Evelyn, I built this. Alone. Her lips curled in disdain. And I preserved it. While you locked yourself away, I fought in the boardrooms. I silenced the vultures. And now, after all these years, you risk it all. For him? She jabbed a finger toward Ben, who shrank back, cheeks flushing with shame. Jonathan's chest tightened. He saw in that gesture an echo of his father, the man who once cast him aside for being inconvenient, a liability to reputation. His jaw clenched. I will not abandon him, Jonathan said quietly, but with a finality that shook the room. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. He is not your son. His mother is a thief. Do you think society will separate him from her crime? No. They will drag his name, and yours, through the mud. At the word thief, Ben flinched. His small hands gripped the pillbox until his knuckles whitened. He whispered, barely audible, She only wanted to help me. Jonathan heard it. The tremor in that voice struck deeper than any argument. He turned to his sister, his voice low, rough with fury. Our mother died when we were children. Father chose reputation over love. Do you remember the silence in this house after the funeral? Do you remember what it was to be unwanted? Evelyn faltered for the briefest moment, a shadow crossing her face. But pride smothered it quickly. This is different, she snapped. You can't rewrite history with sentiment. Jonathan stepped closer, towering above her, his voice rising not in anger, but in command, the same voice that once bent entire councils of investors to his will. No, Evelyn, this is exactly the same. Father turned his back on me. I will not turn mine on him. Silence fell. The fire cracked. The boy stared up, eyes wide, as though witnessing something he had never believed possible. An adult fighting for him, not against him. Evelyn's face hardened into marble. She gathered her purse, her heels striking the floor like gunshots. Very well, but when this destroys you, don't expect me to pick up the pieces. She swept out, leaving the air colder in her absence. Jonathan remained still, his fists unclenching slowly. He turned, knelt before Ben, and touched the boy's trembling hands. You are not her shame, he said, voice trembling now, stripped of its armor. And you will never be my disgrace. You hear me? Ben nodded, tears streaking down his face. For the first time, he let the pillbox slip from his hands. Jonathan caught it, held it, and understood. The world had chosen to see this child as a burden. But to him, Ben was no burden. He was a vow. And vows, once spoken, bound Jonathan Hale more tightly than any empire ever could. Night in Monaco carried its own kind of silence, the hush of wealth. In the hills above the glittering harbor, the Hale mansion stood cloaked in quiet luxury. But inside its walls, Jonathan Hale paced like a man at war. He had fought his sister, defied whispers, silenced boardroom threats. But the one battle he could not quiet was the storm within. He had taken a vow to protect Ben. Yet vows, he knew, were easy when spoken in firelight and infinitely harder when tested by the shadows outside. That test arrived sooner than he imagined. It began innocently enough. A week later, Ben was taken to the city hospital for a routine checkup. His cough, though better, still worried Jonathan. He insisted on the finest physicians, the best care. A social worker accompanied them, as the law required. Children with imprisoned parents were never allowed out of sight. Jonathan waited in the hallway, restless. He told himself he was being overprotective, but deep inside, unease gnawed at him. He had seen the men in Milan. He knew the hunger in their eyes. Then, chaos. A scream echoed from the examination room. The door flew open. The social worker stumbled out, her face white with terror. "They took him!" Jonathan's blood froze. He stormed inside. The room was empty, window shattered, curtain flapping in the breeze. The bed was overturned, medical tools scattered like bones. On the floor lay the pillbox, crushed beneath a boot. For a heartbeat, Jonathan could not breathe. He had once stood at his mother's grave, watching the earth close over her coffin, and thought he would never feel that kind of helplessness again. But this was worse. Far worse. Because this time, he had sworn to protect. The phone rang within the hour. Jonathan snatched it up, his voice shaking with rage. A distorted voice hissed across the line. 24 hours, 100,000 euros, or the boy disappears forever. Jonathan's hand tightened around the receiver until his knuckles whitened. If you harm him. The line cut. Silence answered. Jonathan collapsed into a chair, chest heaving. He had faced billion-dollar crises, collapses that could ruin nations. But this was his nightmare returned, to lose again, to stand powerless while the world stole from him what he could not replace. He buried his face in his hands, a sound torn from his throat, half a roar, half a sob. Night fell heavy. Jonathan gathered every resource at his disposal. His security chief scoured the streets. His lawyers called the police. His influence twisted through the veins of Monaco's institutions. But even with all his power, the trail was smoke. And as the hours bled away, Jonathan found himself alone in the library, staring at the pillbox on his desk. Its surface was cracked now, the last symbol of the mother who had gone to prison for her son. He picked it up, closed his fist around it, and whispered into the darkness, "Not again. I lost her. I will not lose him." The fire burned low. Outside, the sea hammered the cliffs with relentless fury, as if echoing the war inside his chest. Jonathan Hale, man of empires, faced his own greatest ruin. Not the loss of wealth, but the loss of the only fragile hope that had walked into his life with a trembling plea. And somewhere in a hidden room, a 5-year-old boy cried out into the darkness, clutching a blanket too thin to guard him, waiting for the father he had only just begun to believe in. Barcelona's harbor slept beneath a curtain of fog, its cranes jutting into the night sky like rusted skeletons. Cargo ships loomed like giants in the gloom, their horns moaning across black water. Somewhere within that labyrinth of steel and salt, a 5-year-old boy waited, stolen from safety, held for ransom. Jonathan Hale's car rolled to a halt outside the abandoned warehouses. He stepped into the night, his coat whipping in the wind, his face carved with fury. He had been many things in his life: tycoon, manipulator, survivor. But never had he felt the raw ache that throbbed in his chest now. This was not about empire, not about power. This was about blood that was not his, yet felt more sacred than his own. Behind him, a small squad of police waited for his signal. But Jonathan could not wait. He strode forward, his voice a silent vow. If I fail as a father. Inside the warehouse, shadows moved, The kidnappers were rough men, seasoned by alleys and hunger. They had tied Ben to a chair, tape at his wrists, a ragged blanket over his shoulders. His eyes glistened with fear, yet behind them flickered something else: memory. Ben had always listened more than he spoke. He remembered voices, names, secrets whispered when men thought a child could not understand. Now, as the kidnappers argued about the ransom, about whether the Hale family would pay, Ben repeated their words silently, engraving them into his mind. One man barked, "Shut up, Marco. You'll spook the boy." Another snapped back, "Don't use my name, idiot." Ben's lips curved into the faintest, defiant smile. Then, the crash. The doors burst open. Floodlights blazed. Police poured into the warehouse, shouting commands. The kidnappers spun, cursing, scrambling for weapons, and Jonathan was there. He charged through the chaos, his eyes finding the boy instantly. He cut through men and shadows alike, his voice breaking the air. "Ben!" The boy's cry split the night. "Dad!" It was not calculation, not hesitation. The word erupted raw, instinctive, as if his heart had known it all along. Jonathan's arms wrapped around him, lifting him from the chair, shielding him against his chest. Bullets cracked the air, glass shattered, men shouted, but all Jonathan heard was the boy's heartbeat against him, fragile, alive. One of the kidnappers lunged, shouting, but Ben twisted in Jonathan's hold and cried out the name he had memorized. Marco. "He's Marco!" The man froze, eyes wide, his anonymity shattered. The police seized him instantly. The gang unraveled, panic consuming them. And then, it was over. The police dragged the kidnappers away. The fog began to clear. Jonathan sank to his knees on the concrete, still clutching Ben. His coat was torn, his hands bleeding, but none of it mattered. He pressed his forehead to the boy's hair, trembling. His voice broke, words strangled by tears he had not allowed in decades. "I will never let you go. Do you hear me? Never again." Ben buried his face against his chest, whispering through tears, "I knew you'd come." For Jonathan Hale, the tycoon who had once believed money was the only fortress, this moment was the truest wealth he had ever held. In the wreckage of a Barcelona night, amid sirens and shattered glass, father and son were born in the same breath. The Palais de Justice stood like a fortress upon the Ile de la Cité, its gray towers piercing a sky bruised with autumn clouds. Paris moved around it with its usual rhythm, cafes buzzing, bells chiming from Notre Dame. But inside, silence carried the weight of destiny. Jonathan Hale had faced tribunals of bankers, hostile takeovers, and governments that bent like reeds or broke like glass, yet never had his hands trembled the way they did as he placed them on the polished oak of the courtroom bench. At the far side, small and solemn, sat Ben. His legs swung above the floor, unable to touch ground. He wore a jacket too large for his shoulders, the pillbox tucked deep into its pocket like a secret. The judge's eyes rested on him with a mixture of pity and scrutiny. This was not about ransom now. This was not about money. This was about law. The law that saw Ben as a child of a convict, property of the state, a ward to be placed in foster care. Jonathan's petition to adopt him was extraordinary, controversial, scandalous. Billionaires were expected to buy yachts, not children's futures. The gavel struck. "Benjamin Hale," the judge began, "you have been placed under state protection. Today we decide whether you shall remain so, or whether you shall be placed permanently in the custody of Mr. Jonathan Hale." The courtroom stirred. Lawyers whispered. Journalists scribbled. Evelyn Hale sat stone-faced in the gallery, her disapproval as sharp as a knife. The judge turned to Ben. "Child, do you understand what this means?" Ben swallowed. His lips trembled. He looked from the judge to the crowd, then to Jonathan. Jonathan leaned forward, eyes burning with something fierce yet tender. He did not speak. He simply held the boy's gaze as if pouring every vow, every sleepless night, every desperate prayer into that silent exchange. The judge pressed again. "Do you wish to remain under the protection of the state, or do you wish to live with Mr. Hale?" The silence could have broken marble. Then the boy stood. His voice, though thin, rang with clarity. "I want to live with him, with Dad." The word sliced through the courtroom, clean and undeniable. Dad. Jonathan's breath caught. He bowed his head, overcome. He had been called many things. Magnate, shark, tyrant, but never this. And now, in one syllable, he was remade. Gasps rippled across the benches. The journalists' pens froze mid-stroke. Even Evelyn shifted, her mask cracking for a single instant. The judge studied the child, then the man. His gavel struck once more. By this declaration, the court recognizes Jonathan Hale as the legal guardian of Benjamin Hale. The hall erupted in murmurs, flashes from cameras, the rustle of scandal and wonder. But Jonathan heard none of it. He had risen, crossed the floor, and gathered the boy into his arms. Tears burned his cheeks. Tears he no longer hid. "Dad," Ben whispered again into his coat, and Jonathan clutched him tighter, as though the word itself were a crown heavier and holier than any empire. On that autumn day in Paris, law bowed not to precedent, but to love. And in the heart of a billionaire long thought untouchable, a boy's voice had carved the one title he would carry beyond marble, beyond glass towers, beyond death itself. Paris had given them a verdict. The law had spoken. But for Jonathan Hale, fatherhood was not meant to be sealed only in a courtroom. It had to be lived, breathed, shared. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan found himself haunted by the faces he had glimpsed during the ordeal. Children shivering in alleys, waiting outside prison gates for mothers who never returned, staring blankly from the windows of orphanages where hope thinned like mist. He could not forget. He would not. One night, as he walked the halls of the mansion, he passed the spot near the garden where Ben had once asked to sleep in a doghouse. The memory burned through him like fire. That small, desperate plea was not just his story, it was the story of thousands of children across Europe. And so he acted. Within months, Jonathan announced a new foundation, Ben's Haven. It would not be another glittering charity gala or a plaque etched with his name. It would be a network of real places, warm houses, safe beds, classrooms filled with books, built for children whose parents were in prison or gone or unable to protect them. "We will not build shelters of stone," Jonathan declared at the launch, his hand resting on Ben's shoulder. "We will build sanctuaries of dignity." The press doubted him. Rivals sneered that it was a publicity stunt. Evelyn accused him of risking the family fortune. But Jonathan no longer lived for their approval. He lived for the small hand that squeezed his sleeve as he spoke. The inaugural home opened in Lyon, in a quiet neighborhood shaded by chestnut trees. Its walls were painted in bright colors, its windows wide to let in sunlight. On the first morning, a dozen children arrived, silent, cautious, carrying bags no larger than their sorrow. Ben was there, standing at the gate. At just 5 years old, his presence was not symbolic. It was living proof. He greeted each child not with speeches, but with a smile that said, "I know where you've been. I was there too." Jonathan watched from a distance as Ben offered a toy to a younger boy, helped a girl find her room, whispered encouragement when another refused to enter. He realized then that Ben did not see himself as the rescued. He saw himself as the rescuer. On the day of the second home's inauguration, cameras flashed, reporters jostled. Jonathan delivered his speech, but when they turned to the boy, Ben spoke in a voice both soft and steady. "My mom went to prison because she tried to save me. I thought I had no one. But now I have a dad. And I want every kid who feels alone to know. They can have someone too." Silence fell. No headline could capture the purity of it. Jonathan bent down, his throat tight, and whispered so only Ben could hear. "Yes, son. We are giving them what you once asked for. A place to sleep. But more than that, a reason to believe." Soon, Ben's haven spread beyond France. Madrid, Berlin, Warsaw, Prague. Every house bore the same white emblem above its door, a small shelter with a heart inside. And in each city, Jonathan stood beside his son, no longer the isolated magnate, but a man reborn through fatherhood. At every opening, he remembered the storm night, the trembling plea, the doghouse. And each time, as children stepped across the threshold, Jonathan felt the vow in his chest burn brighter. Never again shall a child measure their worth by less than a dog. By the end of that year, hundreds of children had roofs over their heads, meals in their stomachs, and hope in their eyes. Yet Jonathan knew the true miracle was not in the buildings, but in the boy who had inspired them. And Ben, still clutching the old pillbox, though he no longer needed its medicine, would look up at his father and ask, almost shyly, "Dad, we're helping kids like me, aren't we?" Jonathan would kneel, brush his son's hair back, and answer with the only truth that mattered, "Yes, Ben. And we'll keep helping them for as long as we breathe." Spring returned to Monaco with a gentleness that seemed almost miraculous. The storms had passed, the air was sweet with salt and blossoms, and the Hale mansion, once a monument to silence, now carried the echoes of a child's laughter. Where once its marble halls had been barren, now drawings lined the walls, toys hid beneath chairs, and the sound of footsteps no longer belonged to a single man. But it was the garden that changed most of all. Jonathan had long neglected it, leaving its grounds to caretakers who trimmed hedges with precision but no soul. Now, under Ben's presence, the garden was alive again, sunflowers nodding in the breeze, wild roses climbing trellises, the grass littered with soccer balls and paper planes. Children from the first Ben's Haven home often visited, their laughter spilling across the lawns. The mansion was no longer a fortress. It was a sanctuary. And in the center of the garden stood something unexpected. A small, white doghouse. Jonathan had ordered it built exactly where the boy had once stood, trembling in the storm, clutching his empty pillbox and whispering the words that had pierced his heart. "Can I sleep in your doghouse?" The doghouse was not meant to be used. It was a monument. Around it bloomed a circle of flowers, planted by the children themselves. Tulips, daisies, sunflowers, bright colors defying the memory of despair. On its roof, a bronze plaque glimmered in the sunlight. The inscription read, "For every child once forgotten, now found. May no one ever again ask for less than love." On the day of its unveiling, Jonathan stood beside Ben, his arm resting gently on the boy's shoulder. Dozens of children from Ben's Haven were gathered, their voices rising in laughter and song. Reporters and dignitaries lingered at the edges, but for once their presence did not matter. This moment belonged to the children. Ben gazed up at the plaque, then looked at his father. His voice was quiet, but steady. "Dad, this is where it all began, isn't it?" Jonathan swallowed hard. "Yes, son. Right here. A storm, a question, and a promise." Ben slipped his small hand into Jonathan's, holding tight. "Then this isn't just a doghouse anymore. It's our beginning." Jonathan bent down, kissed the top of his son's head, and whispered so only he could hear, "No, Ben. It's more than our beginning. It's the beginning of thousands." The wind stirred, carrying with it the sound of laughter from the children playing nearby. Jonathan closed his eyes, and for the first time in decades, felt his mother's presence, not as grief, but as peace. He had broken the chain of abandonment. He had chosen love over reputation. And so the doghouse, once a symbol of despair, became a beacon of hope. From that garden in Monaco, the legacy of compassion spread outward, into every home of Ben's Haven, into the lives of children who would grow up never doubting their worth. Empires rise and crumble, fortunes are built and lost. But love creates a legacy no storm can erase, and all of it began with a boy's trembling voice in the rain. Dear friends, if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel. Every view, every comment, every share helps us bring more stories of hope, love, and hidden strength to light. Thank you for walking with us until the end. Your presence means more than words can say. Together, let's keep building a world where no child is ever left outside in the storm.